Hi, I'm Izzy Conn, and welcome back to Leading Labour and this episode on Jeremy Corbyn, the final episode in the Leading Labour series. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each of the former Labour leaders. We look at how each leader responded to the major political developments of their day, managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and overall, how they sought to win elections and bring Labour into government. Sending shockwaves through the political system, Corbyn took over from Ed Miliband in 2015 and was Labour leader for 4 years, leading Labour through 2 general elections. He was born in 1949 in Wiltshire. His parents were both peace campaigners, and Corbyn joined the local Labour Party while he was still at school. After moving to Shropshire, Corbyn attended grammar school in Newport, leaving aged 18 with 2 A-levels, both grade E. He then spent 2 years in Jamaica, before returning to the UK, moving to London and working in various trade unions. He was then elected to Haringey Council, before becoming the MP for Islington North in the 1983 general election. Corbyn was always on the left of Labour. I spoke to Sunday Times Whitehall editor Gabriel Pogrund for this episode. He co-authored the book Left Out, The Inside Story of Labour under Corbyn. Let's hear from him on Corbyn's political inspirations.
There's one political hero who looms large over Corbyn's career and who provides a template for Corbyn personally and politically and intellectually, and that is Tony Benn. Tony Benn was the standard bearer of the left in Parliament for decades. Corbyn was part of a kind of coterie following his election in 1983 of youngish and very devoted supporters of Benn's. The sort of Bennite philosophy was, socialism in the country, democracy within the Labour Party, and that was really the prism through which Jeremy Corbyn saw politics himself.
Corbyn was a backbencher until the day he was elected as leader. He often rebelled and had voted against the new Labour governments 428 times. But he lacked leadership experience. Let's hear from Andy McSmith, former senior lobby journalist at The Independent, who knew Corbyn in his earlier years.
It is a leadership role. Every problem in the organisation finds its way up towards the leader. And so you do need some kind of managerial skill. And Jeremy had been an MP when he came in as leader. He'd been an MP for 32 years. He was in his 60s. He'd not been in charge of anything. He hadn't really taken that much of a part in the even in parliamentary jobs, even the sort of committee jobs that you do in Parliament, where you mix with other MPs and see you deal with the details of legislation. He hardly did any of that because he was so far out on the left that the Labour whips didn't really want him involved in it. So his activity was involved looking after his constituents and being a speaker at left-wing meetings. And there was no kind of preparation for the job he was suddenly propelled into when he was nearly 70 years old.
James Schneider was Corbyn's Director of Strategic Communications from October 2016.
He wasn't expecting or planning to be leader. I mean, you've probably met quite a lot of politicians and what's the politest way of saying this? They have an oversized sense of their own brilliance in general terms. And therefore, the most random, lowly backbencher has spent much of their life dreaming about being Prime Minister and being party leader and so on. And Jeremy is not like that in the slightest. So he wasn't thinking, well, what would it be like when I run the Labour Party?
By 2015, many on the left within the Labour Party had come to feel let down by Ed Miliband, who had initially stood as a more left-wing candidate for leader. Let's hear about these frustrations from James Meadway. James was economic policy advisor to Corbyn's shadow chancellor, John McDonnell.
He positioned himself as somebody on the left who was going to be able to oppose the Tories, and we had to get back to some, proper Labour sort of values and things. And he didn't really. He sort of tried to deliver on some parts of that, and then ultimately didn't. He ended up with this ridiculous position of total fudge and austerity. So a real disappointment, and a disappointment that he lost, obviously, but also just a disappointment that he wasn't delivering some of the stuff that he could have done and should have done. On the right of the party, it was completely opposite. It was, this was because Ed Miliband was far too left wing, and had he not been so left wing, and had he been more consistently in line with what the Tories had defined as a new settlement in Britain, then we would have won.
Once Miliband resigned on the day of the 2015 election, a leadership election began, and Andy Burnham, Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall all stepped forward as candidates. Political allies of Corbyn on the left, in a group called the Socialist Campaign Group, had stood for the leadership before. John McDonnell had attempted to stand against Brown in 2007, though failed to receive enough nominations from MPs. And Diane Abbott had stood for the leadership in 2010, gaining just 7.24% of first-round votes. They encouraged Corbyn to stand in 2015.
Jeremy Corbyn was almost the last man standing, and he was always regarded as this, shadow foreign secretary of the hard left. He had his kind of, to some, esoteric and idiosyncratic causes. He was always a lone, less a lone ranger, but had his own causes and his own ideas, and wasn't necessarily interested in building a faction or a coalition within the party around himself. He was, the most improbable candidate imaginable. He was almost an anti-candidate, but the left wanted him to stand anyway.
To become an official candidate, 35 nominations were needed from MPs, and Corbyn initially struggled to meet this threshold. But more MPs nominated him at the last minute to broaden the debate by including a left candidate.
The way they saw it was, Jeremy's innocent. Yeah, he's not going to win, but he's a nice guy. Okay, yeah, we know that if his politics ever took root within the country, it would be a problem. That's how his adversaries would see him, but they'd always see him as being friendly and decent. He found himself advocating, without equivocation against austerity, and his opponents were all to varying degrees members of the spadocracy. Been spads, they'd been special advisors who'd served during the New Labour years. Many of them were architects of New Labour, and as such were vulnerable to criticism that they were the authors of the situation that the country found itself in part, or were, at least in some way responsible.
Corbyn inspired Labour members who had become frustrated at their party over the years for being too much on the right. James Schneider recalls a debate in Nuneaton, which had been seen as the bellwether seat in the 2015 election, in which the audience was made up of former Labour voters who had voted Conservative or UKIP in 2015.
And the first question comes from the floor, and it's something about the legacy of New Labour. And the first New Labour candidate says, I'm not New Labour or Old Labour, I'm True Labour. And the second New Labour candidate says, I'm not inside out or back to front Labour, I'm twirling, always towards freedom Labour. And then the third one said, I'm not soundbite Labour, but this is not a time for soundbites. I feel the hand of history upon my shoulder Labour. And then went to Jeremy, he was the last one, and he said, I'd just like to say to Tony Blair, why did you get so close to George W. Bush and take us into a horrible illegal war in Iraq? And the room explodes. It's like this pressure valve has been released, and it hit the emotional moment that the technocratic centre collapsed in 2008, and until Labour moved on from that, we would carry on losing. And so that, for me, was the meaning of the Corbyn leadership election in 2015.
During the campaign, Corbyn won the support of two of the biggest unions, Unite and Unison. Here's James Meadway.
Jeremy offers something out of that fudge. And also, beyond that, I think for a section of the membership, and certainly for a section of the wider left, just a chance to reclaim some of the stuff that New Labour abandoned. I mean, particularly around, privatisation and whether things should be in public ownership, and a broader commentary on inequality and this sort of thing.
As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, Miliband had made a small decision to change the way that Labour leaders were elected, moving from an electoral college system, where votes were weighted, to a system of one member, one vote. Corbyn became leader on the 12th of September 2015, with a huge majority of 59.5% of first preference votes. Here's Gabriel Pogrund.
So Corbyn basically tapped into an energy and a moment within the grassroots of the party and won wholly accidentally and emphatically, and managed to weld together this coalition of people on the traditional, what one might call hard left, but then also people on the soft left who were idealists and had values and principles and felt that New Labour no longer cared about those values and principles.
This was an absolute travesty for the mainstream Labour Party. The parliamentary party had overwhelmingly backed other candidates by 210 to 20. But for the left, and for many Labour members, it was hugely exciting. He immediately began to shift Labour to the left, speaking clearly against austerity, for taxing higher earners, and for nationalisation. So, what were Corbyn's intentions as leader?
Even then, in the early phases of when Corbyn won, there was always this question as to, well, is this about protest or is this about power? It had initially been about protest. It was a protest candidacy designed to, keep the party sweet, as the left would have seen it, and it became a protest movement which happened to storm the Labour Party headquarters and basically seize the citadel, or whatever metaphor you want to use. They suddenly found themselves in this position. But there was this early reckoning of, well, what is this leadership going to be? How long is this going to last? Is it going to be over by Christmas? I mean, it's September 2015. How long can this possibly last? And also, in the meantime, what are we here to do?
He was going to cut against the grain of what governing in Britain would look like, but would do so in a way that was very popular with Labour members, popular with trade unions, and popular, I think, with a great chunk of the wider public.
One of the big goals of Corbyn's premiership was to shift the debate within the Labour Party and in turn the country about austerity.
I also spoke to Max Guarini, a political scientist at Bristol University who wrote his PhD on Corbyn's visual representation in the media, something we'll talk about later.
Corbyn represented the first real sort of serious political challenge. And, in the UK, because we have the two-party system, that challenge really has to come from either Labour or the Conservatives. But Corbyn was the first real challenge here to the neoliberal dogma, which has kind of come to dominate across the British political spectrum since Margaret Thatcher's tenure as PM.
The right of the party were absolutely incensed and panicked.
Let's be clear, Corbyn's election sort of precipitated a nervous breakdown within the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and it is impossible to sort of say in one sentence how the Labour Party responded to it, because there was no coherence or necessarily clarity to what the parliamentary Labour Party thought, what former leaders thought, what people within the party headquarters thought. Everybody had their own response.
How did James Meadway feel the right reacted to Corbyn's election as leader?
That Jeremy was an utter aberration in Labour Party history and had to be removed as fast as possible, and he would be removed as fast as possible. And that ultimately, if he was exposed to a kind of electoral test, he'd lose so badly that the left would be destroyed forever and they could have their party back. And this had come out of nowhere.
There were plenty of people who thought from the very outset, I cannot participate in this. I don't know how long it's going to last. Frankly, I'll do my best to hasten its demise. But in the meantime, I will, on a moral level, have nothing to do with it. There were definitely people around, within the PLP, within the Parliamentary Labour Party, within unions and within the Socialist Campaign Group who wanted to make Corbynism a success. And it wasn't just the members of the Socialist Campaign Group, so your Diane Abbott's, your John McDonnell's.
Prominent names in the shadow cabinet during Corbyn's leadership were John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, Emily Thornberry, Barry Gardiner, Richard Bergen, Tom Watson, Jonathan Ashworth and Keir Starmer. John McDonnell was Shadow Chancellor. Let's hear from James Meadway.
Is to have somebody, I say traditional setup, it's probably not really, but in people's heads it is what you're supposed to do, which is you find someone from the right of the party who knows about economics to go and be your shadow chancellor. And it rarely works particularly well, frankly. So Jeremy refused to do that. He was obviously going to have John there, and that made for a very, very close relationship with the two of them that they already had, which I think was central to actually getting the thing moving at all. Because him and John had such a long working relationship over decades on the Labour back backbenchers. He really trusted John to make policy decisions around economic policy. They were on the same page completely about things. Jeremy has actually a much closer interest in these things than people tend to give him credit for, because they think he's all about foreign policy, which is his, sort of his subject that he knows about and he's deeply informed on. But he always had a clear view of what he wanted to do on the economy.
Much of the story of Corbyn's leadership involves crises, which are often explained as being down to his inexperience in leadership roles. But at this point, let's look at the pros of his leadership. Here's James Schneider and James Meadway.
He's a very nice... he's probably the nicest person I've ever met, in really straightforwardly true terms. He's extremely nice. He always sees the good in people.
He's a really, really good campaigner. That's just kind of obvious. He was very, very good at relating to people on a kind of campaigny basis. He had the strength of not really being like a politician. It comes across, everyone says this, and he's kind of not really like a politician. He just doesn't do political things. And he also provided a space, I think, where people could have a sense of, they could project onto him what they wanted to happen in the future. Right? And they could get a sense of this is how things could be different in not necessarily always very clearly formulated ways, but people got that sense that this could be different, and he symbolised that for a time at least.
Taxing the rich, public spending, public ownership, national minimum wage, a huge set of issues where these were not in public discourse at all, because we have an extraordinarily narrow public discourse which represents elite consensus opinion, and Corbyn crashed through that and put things back on the table, like public ownership, for example. That's a clear example. Greatest single strength is that he's true. He is principled. He was true to himself. And when we were able, as a team, him as part of that team, when we were able as a team to have that shine through, things went very well.
Many in the close team around Corbyn felt that parts of the party were purposely working against them and inhibiting their progress.
Most Labour Party staffers just sort of want to do their job, and rightly so. They see themselves as a kind of party civil service. They're committed to what the party does. They support the leadership, and they want to do their job well. And that was my basic experience with most of the people I had to deal with. There was also, I think, a more obvious, often in senior position, politically motivated, factionally motivated, would be a better way to describe it, factionally motivated section of staff. The primary barrier was the dysfunction of the Labour Party itself. It was not prepared to accept a result like this. If you take a large part of its institutional setup, like how staff behave, how the party structures operate, what things like sort of regional officers and the regional party and the rest of the country does, what councillors and other people are set up to do, it was not prepared to have a result like this turn up after a long period of time, assuming the left was basically reduced to a kind of harmless pet off the side, someone making a bit of noise every so often, but mostly can be ignored, and suddenly we're running the party. So that was absolutely not going to be accepted by large parts of the party, and that made it deeply dysfunctional. Like, things just didn't work. You'd write a press release and it would disappear into the press office and not emerge for hours later, which would then turn into a story about your incompetence and not getting a press release out. And it's like, this was written and ready to go. So it was kind of relentless like this. Emails would get leaked on a sort of regular basis. I mean, regardless of how interesting these things actually were, it was continual, and it was a minority of staff doing it, and it spoke to a deeply dysfunctional organisation. Beyond that, I think we didn't have, in the end, an effective strategy to deal with that dysfunction. They call it a broad church, but it's an extremely sort of disparate group. It's quite clear what the membership sort of want, which is a Labour government that does nice things, like sort of fairly broadly defined. But then if you get into the institutional structures around that, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the full-time staff, its relationships with trade unions, this sort of thing, like managing all of that is very, very difficult. And then managing also its peculiar relationship as the kind of second party of effectively the British state, that it's always a party of government. And so it's managing what it thinks of about what it will do in government and what the possibilities of government are. So everything it does is kind of defined against what can you actually do in government and how will you do this.
He also resented the day-to-day behind-the-scenes expectations of being leader.
I mean, he was not interested in the practicalities of the job. And frankly, he wasn't necessarily that good at them. I mean, he hated all the trappings of office. He hated having a security detail. He hated having to be in Parliament all the time when he'd always been an extra parliamentary leftist who happened to be an MP. he was all about grassroots and all these movements rather than sitting on the green benches with his order paper in his hand all day long.
Any leader has to learn a lot at the outset of their leadership, but the fact that he had operated on the left fringes of the Labour Party since before 1983 meant he had to make much more of an adjustment than most leaders have. Here's Andy McSmith.
You could see the confusion he was in at his very first party conference as leader, when in one of his interviews he was asked about nuclear weapons. And he said what he must have said dozens of times before in meetings, that nuclear weapons are immoral and that he would never use them. What he forgot was that you can say all that in a meeting of activists and you get a rousing cheer. You say it on national television and people who work in the arms industry hear him. And of course there was immediate reaction from the trade unions who represent people working in the arms industry. Len McCluskey, who was very close to Corbyn, faced a threat that 30,000 of his members in the arms industry were going to defect to another union. So he and the head of the GMB basically went into Corbyn and told him, you can't say this, you've got to stop it. And meanwhile, of course, his shadow cabinet members were coming out on television and saying, this is not Labour Party policy. And he can't have, it just probably didn't cross his mind that you can say something all your life, but one day when you're leader of the Labour Party, if you say it, loads of people are going to hear it who've never heard it before and they're not going to like it.
The first really important event of Corbyn's leadership, and ultimately the event that would define this period in British politics, was the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, which David Cameron had called for the 23rd of June 2016. Tim Bale is Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University and has written widely on the Conservative Party. Let's hear from him on why Cameron called the referendum.
There were over 100 Conservative MPs who wanted a referendum and were likely to vote leave and were pressing him very hard to get one. They were also able to point to the success that UKIP seemed to be having after 2010. And there was a fear that if he didn't call the referendum himself, that in the end, he or a future Conservative Prime Minister was going to be forced into it. Cameron, I think, always saw himself as a winner. He thought that he would be able to pull off a victory, particularly, obviously, if economic arguments were made well enough to convince people that although some reform was needed, Britain's best interests were to stay in the European Union.
Cameron, in calling the referendum, had always assumed that Labour would, throw its weight behind the Remain campaign.
Corbyn had been a long-standing Eurosceptic. He voted to leave in Wilson's 1975 referendum. And, as a backbencher, he'd voted many times against ratifying EU treaties. In a quote from 1993, he described the great danger to the cause of socialism in this country or any other country of the imposition of a banker's Europe on the people of this country.
So his position is he's extremely in favour of all of the social and environmental rights and protections that come from the EU. And he likes collaborating beyond borders and so on and so forth, and is broadly opposed to the economic neoliberal strictures on the ability to run a social democratic state, basically the Maastricht Treaty.
Once he became leader and under pressure from MPs, he stated that Labour would campaign to stay in the EU in the upcoming referendum. But many felt frustrated he never fully threw himself behind the EU cause, famously stating he was about 7.5 out of 10 passionate about staying in the EU. Many within the pro-EU camp felt that had Labour had a really strong Remain campaigner as leader, the result of the referendum would have been different.
In his eyes, he liked bits of it, but he's profoundly disagreed with other bits of it, and he couldn't tell himself and he couldn't tell other people that it was more straightforward than that. And his claim later on and his justification was, I said that because I felt it, but also I felt that was realistic, and that's where a lot of the country are at. You know, most people don't go around in a blue beret with yellow stars on the top, acting as though they're claiming to be kind of completely uncomplicatedly full-throated supporters of Brussels. And why would I have done the same? It would have been inauthentic, and authenticity was key to him.
Now, Jeremy went all over the country campaigning. He did the most campaign visits of anyone. You know, there's all of that information. He did the most campaign visits by miles. He travelled the most miles in the country of all campaigners on either side. The only British politician with any platform who could appeal to the marginal voter, who in this election is someone who doesn't like the EU, but could vote Remain, is Jeremy, because that was sort of his position. I don't want to give David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and the rest of them a blank cheque to do what they like. And if that message had been the message from the Labour Party and had been more front and centre, then I think the result would have been closer. Now, that would have meant that the tenor of the public debate would have been more Euro-critical, but that doesn't mean that Remain would have lost.
Corbyn was a felt absence, and he claimed he was, travelling the length and breadth of the country, but the fact is we'll never know what the outcome might have been if Labour had found itself with a more unequivocal champion of the EU during that moment.
Coordination was very, was quite poor, I think, probably between Jeremy's team, the Labour campaign, and the official Remain campaign. Probably a combination of structural, contingent and personality factors. They also expected that, Jeremy would deliver their lines, and their lines were terrible.
I also spoke to Richard Corbett for this episode. He was the leader of the European Parliamentary Labour Party from 2017 to 2020, and I also spoke to Neil Kinnock, Labour Party leader from 1983 to 1992. They both argued that Corbyn's failure to deliver a clear message on the EU did contribute to the vote to leave.
There was some polling that showed that 40% or more of people who identify as Labour voters didn't know what the Labour Party position was when they voted. So a person speaking clearly to that audience, if it only shifted a couple of percent of them, that might have made a difference.
He had all of the leftist hang-ups over the European Union and the single market and the customs union and everything else, probably including Father Christmas, I don't know. But anyway, he himself said he was 7 out of 10 in favour. Not good enough, certainly not in a referendum.
The Leave campaign ultimately won the referendum, with 51.9% of the vote to Remain's 48.1%.
I wasn't with him when it came through, but his response was that that's how people have voted, so that's now what has to happen. He took a basic democratic position to it, which was, of course, the right thing to do.
This was obviously an enormous moment in British political history that caused years of chaos. Many Labour members and voters had wanted to stay in, and James Meadway says this led to indecision within the Labour leadership.
So you're going to have to accept it, and that was not going to significantly change without very major political forces trying to change it. That sat uneasily with what the Labour Party membership would have wanted, which was definitely to stay in, and what most Labour voters, including Labour voters in places that voted Leave, wanted, which was also to stay in. So the next step was like, well, what does a kind of happy compromise that most people would sort of tolerate look like? And that, I think, is where we slipped up.
The days after the referendum, MPs launched a coup against Corbyn, blaming what they described as his weak campaigning for the referendum result. The original shadow cabinet resigned, led by Hilary Benn, Corbyn's political hero's son, and 37 out of 40 political advisers left with them. 172 MPs voted that they had no confidence in Corbyn's leadership, with only 40 voting that they did have confidence in him. Here's Andy McSmith.
When there was a no confidence vote in Jeremy Corbyn, it was 4-1 against. So 4/5 of Labour MPs didn't have confidence in him. As soon as the MPs had voted to sack him, he just went outside and there were dozens and dozens of adoring supporters backing him, and he basically said he basically ignored the vote.
Corbyn and his allies decided he would remain in post. Corbyn said that the vote had no constitutional legitimacy and said he would not betray the members who had voted for him by resigning. But this meant that Corbyn's team began to see themselves as a somewhat separate venture to the predominant Labour machine, to an even greater extent than they maybe had initially. So, how did factionalism manifest?
Typically not. I mean, typically in terms of personal relationships, people would be personally nice to you, to me anyway. I mean, the only way to deal with this is try and be personally nice to everyone. What you discover in private, and we know this from the sort of leaked WhatsApp conversations, is something quite different. Yeah, it's complete sort of two-facedness.
He was too nice. I think he had to be like that at the very beginning due to the balance of power.
Tony Blair had spoken out against a risk of Corbyn's leadership before he had even won the race, and continued to do so periodically, causing multiple news stories and the impression of division each time. To some extent, Corbyn's team saw this as a good thing.
Blair was a more problematic figure because he was leader of the Labour Party for a long period of time and won all these elections, and we all know the record. But everybody knows the record, so him popping up and saying, I don't like Jeremy Corbyn, it's kind of a whole bunch of people saying, yeah, well, we don't like you. We really don't like you. So it doesn't necessarily hurt too much. However, it generates that noise and it creates a license, and suddenly it's a news story that Blair's saying this. And, for a bunch of people, it really didn't hurt. To have Tony Blair saying, I hate you, is like, okay. This is a bonus. He must be doing something right, that kind of thing, because he really is not very popular. But it does not work well with the Labour Party and with the media ecosystem in Britain.
Many MPs felt Corbyn was ineffective, disorganised and unable to lead Labour to an election victory. And 1 month after the referendum and after his refusal to resign, Owen Smith, a rising figure on the soft left, challenged him for the leadership. Smith's slogan was Labour's future. At the time, James Schneider was working for Momentum, a grassroots organisation he'd helped set up following Corbyn's election as leader. He says that as soon as Smith announced his leadership, Momentum were ready to support Corbyn's campaign for re-election.
We were all ready for it. We knew that we could run, a lot of us had been involved in the first campaign. We knew that we could run a campaign that was even bigger and better, and that would further entrench Jeremy's authority in the party, and actually we really needed it. In fact, we were saved by and that's how a lot of us in Momentum felt about it, we were saved by the second leadership election, because it brought us back out to both the membership, the movement in the country, where Jeremy's message was popular, and out of those horrible halls in Westminster and the corridors of Labour Party HQ, where they were opposed. I didn't get the impression that at least some of the team in the leadership office at the time, quite understandably, viewed it in the same way, because they were being cooed.
Corbyn survived the challenge, winning 61.8% of the vote and strengthening his majority. In number 10, Theresa May, a Remainer, had taken over from David Cameron, and she would go on to call an election within a year.
We then, having won on the basis of those policies, we then put them through conference and basically got them adopted as party policy. So it provided a very big advance for us, and therefore was a really good summer.
I don't think a leadership election campaign particularly prepares you for what happens in a general election, just because the scale is obviously hugely bigger. You go from membership 400,000 to a country of how many voters is it 45 million potential voters out there, something like that. So it's wildly bigger. So although you get some cues for what a campaign looks like in general and how to organise one, you're suddenly in quite a dramatically different, far more intense place to try and get this working.
While Corbyn's popularity had been reinstated in the party, in the country, Labour's poll ratings were declining.
The second leadership campaign had improved our position on the party a lot. We had a different shadow cabinet that was supportive. But we'd clearly taken a hit in the country because, from a passive observer, it looks mad. The Labour Party tries to get rid of its leader, and it has this big fight. It talks about itself for 3 months and so on and so forth. But, we were sagging. We were sagging.
May called a snap election for the 7th of June 2017, looking to reaffirm the majority she had inherited from Cameron. The Conservatives had not been in election preparation mode, but they were polling at 48%, their highest rating since 2008, while Labour trailed on 24%. It seemed like they were almost guaranteed a landslide. But the calling of this election following the 2014 Scottish referendum, 2015 general election and 2016 Brexit referendum, which triggered a change of Prime Minister, and a Labour leadership election, left some voters feeling frustrated.
You're joking. Not another one? Oh, for God's sake, I can't stand this. There's too much politics going on at the moment. Why does she need to do it?
So a decision was made, excellent decision was made, that we were going to go on a mini policy blitz. The local elections were coming up. The time was to say more about who we were and what we were. And when that happened, we did well. That was the logic. And we had a few of those in the 2 weeks or 12 days, maybe 8 policies announced in 12 days, something like that, up until when May announced on, I think it was the 18th of April. So actually we'd started a campaign, and we were getting in the groove of things. We were getting good headlines. We were getting good pictures. Those 2 weeks before showed actually we really can do this. I pulled back a couple of things that we had ready for the next couple of weeks, so we were ready to go with stuff. The day the election was called, we had an announcement about increasing carers allowance. And we went to Birmingham and Jeremy met the carers, and Tim Farron torpedoed the Lib Dems campaign all on that day. It was glorious.
Labour were entering the election with a much more left-wing platform than they'd had for years and years and years. During the campaign, they made early announcements of potentially unpopular policies, which prevented bombshell stories happening later in the campaign, something that had blown Labour off course during previous elections. Here's James Meadway.
We had very deliberately laid out very early on. I just thought if you're going to say something that is a break with what you're supposed to say or what the media expects you to say, you have to say it early. So if you're going to say we are going to borrow money to invest, you need to say it really early on. If you're going to say we're going to increase taxes for rich people, we've done a load of work in that, which I was expecting to roll out in 2017, but then the election turned up. So one of the first announcements we made was actually on income tax increases for those over £80,000, which runs against the grain of what you should do. But we thought it was worth doing early on.
The campaign was spurred on by all the new campaigners involved with the party. There were loads of new party members and the Momentum movement.
Some of those marginal seats moved because there were people out there knocking on doors. So it really sort of added to that momentum with a small M for what happened during the campaign. But in terms of actual preparation for that was quite a lot of like the election's being called and you just have to go for it. I think there's understanding this might be the one chance people got. Right, either you do this now or you'll never do it again.
May had framed 2017 as the Brexit election, stating, "Let us put forward our plans for Brexit and our alternative programmes for government, and then let the people decide."
So the initial framing of the election from May and then from the media was this is an election about Brexit. And we had to make it not an election about Brexit, that's step one. Step two, then make it an election about the many versus the few.
Labour's key manifesto policies were scrapping tuition fees, nationalising water, railways and energy companies, increasing income tax to 45p on earnings of 80,000 and above, and 50p on earnings above 123,000. Corbyn's foreword said, "Let's build a fairer Britain where no one is held back. A country where everybody is able to get on in life, to have security at work and at home, to be decently paid for the work they do, and to live their lives with the dignity they deserve."
And Corbyn basically came along and said, well, I don't accept those terms and conditions. You might want this to be a Brexit referendum. I'm going to make this a referendum on the economy and on the state of the country and on austerity and on the effect it's had on people's lives. And I'm going to make the case for common ownership, nationalising water, rail and energy. I'm going to make the case for investing much more in the NHS.
James Schneider says they campaigned differently.
In response to the traditional people being like, look, you lay out your stall early, then you just attack the other side, attack. And I'm not interested in attack. we're not normal politicians. We're not running this campaign as if we're just a different, a different team that's going to take over in Westminster. We actually have stuff to offer people. This is a transformational campaign, so I don't want attack ads. I don't want attack dossiers. Just get out what we're about.
Momentum were key to organising Corbyn's election campaign. They ran effective social media campaigns, boosting Labour's visibility among younger voters, and organised thousands of activists.
The Labour's field team, they just thought that they had this incredible machine that worked so well, and the only problem was they didn't have Tony Blair as leader. They could just be allowed to carry on with their same kind of completely outdated, irrelevant to the real needs approach to the ground game. Then they would win. And so we had momentum instead.
Against the better wishes of the traditional Labour Party machinery, they organised rallies.
So in the 2017 election, for example, I'll give a concrete example. The regional offices in the party machine, when we were going around the country, we'll get more into this, I'm sure, but when we were going around the country having big rallies, they didn't like rallies, so they would put us in these tiny community halls and only invite Labour members. So you'd turn up in a place, and who bloody cares? If you turn up in a place and you're in a cold meeting community hall with 100 Labour members, I mean, how many votes have you won?
Corbyn was most effective when communicating like this, and it was where he felt really comfortable, having lived a life of campaigning. Here's Tim Bale.
Labour was actually, very canny about getting him out there, giving the impression, of a kind of surge of enthusiasm for him.
Behind the scenes, though, Corbyn often was not making tactical decisions.
Most of that kind of decision-making, Jeremy isn't making those decisions. Jeremy it's like one level, it's like the values and the principles that inform strategy rather than strategy itself, rather than tactical decisions, rather than operational delivery. He does really love and know a lot about trains. And so he would sometimes get someone involved in whether we should get on this train or that train in order to meet the bus in this particular location or so on. But those are just little idiosyncrasies.
On the Tory side, May ran a really bad campaign. It was presidential, all centering around her, though her personality couldn't really carry it, and she avoided TV debates.
You'd have to say that for the Conservative campaign, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Theresa May simply wasn't capable of carrying the kind of presidential campaign that was designed for her.
As the May campaign began to crumble, then the much clearer identification, few, many, could be hit on the head. But I mean, you need to repeat things endlessly, and I think by the end of the campaign, our message was starting to get across. And if we'd had another 2 weeks, say, even a week, carrying on in the same way that we would have done, it would have crystallised even more.
Once the polls closed, the result, expected initially to be a Tory landslide, became clear. Labour had gained 30 seats and an additional 3.5 million votes, and starved the Conservatives of their majority, though they were still the biggest party. This was Labour's largest increase in vote share since Attlee's landslide in 1945.
They fought the best campaign that they could, given the leader that they had, and the Conservatives, in some senses, fought the worst campaign that they could, given the leader that they had. And I think, you put those two things together, they produced the result that, it was much closer than many people imagined. And indeed, it's one of those very, very unusual elections where you'd have to say the campaign did seem to make a difference.
It's unbelievable relief and release to see, millions and millions of people, over 30 million people voting to tax the rich so that everybody can have decent standard of living, that we can have a more equal and a more sustainable society, that we don't have to have endless wars, that we can be welcoming to refugees. All of these things were what we were fighting for, and it was so beautiful and validating to have it clear that that's where a huge portion of British society was.
There is now evidence to suggest that voters still saw voting Labour and against the Tories who had orchestrated the Brexit referendum as a way of voting to remain, or at least getting a softer version of Brexit than what May was calling for. In some seats, small parties stepped to one side to try and aid either a Labour and in theory Remain or at least soft Brexit win, or a Conservative Leave win. Tactical voting analysis suggested that hundreds of thousands of 2015 Lib Dem voters went Labour to oppose May's Brexit stance, and on the right, UKIP completely collapsed. This meant that the Conservative vote share rose a lot too, by 5.5%, their highest total since 1983. 2017 saw the biggest combined vote share for Labour and the Conservatives since 1970.
Let's say we had ended up with 33%, as some people within the traditional party machinery gleefully told us was all we would get. That would have been an advance of 9. That would have been the biggest. That would have been the biggest increase of a party during an election campaign in British political history. We ended up getting nearly 41. It had objectively been an extremely impressive campaign, and we knew that, and we knew that we'd done something that was impressive, and there was something going on in the country.
James Schneider says that while Corbyn's team was celebrating, the right of the party, what he described as internal opponents, were not sharing in their excitement.
But I've got the side-by-side because the exit poll came out, and I've got a little video of all of our reactions, and there's like gasps and swearing and excitement, and it's that, people realising what it means. And then there are the WhatsApp messages of the people in the room next door reporting that they are grey and ashen-faced as we are cheering, and that it was everything that they've been working against for the last 2 years. And that just gives the perfect encapsulation of what was going on in the Labour Party over that period of time.
Theresa May came back into government, propped up by a confidence and supply deal with the right-wing Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party. 2017 had been, in some respects, a huge success for Corbyn and his team. But it marked the beginning of future failures, as many in Corbyn's inner circle saw this as their moment to impose greater control over party operations and communications, rather than working collaboratively to build on the 2017 result. Some say that they interpreted the result as meaning that they now knew best. Let's hear from James Meadway, who was obviously in the Shadow Chancellor's office.
Suddenly, there was these miracle workers, supposedly, sitting in the leader's office, and there was a real accumulation of power in the leader's office. You had more MPs, so you had more short money, you could employ more people. It was a centralisation process, which I think didn't work out particularly well, actually, as things played out. I think it was probably not well advised to try and say leader's office delivered this election result, therefore they can deliver the next one.
He argues that Corbyn's team began to lack new ideas, and in some ways became victims of their own success. Indeed, Corbyn had still lost, and only Neil Kinnock had ever stayed on to fight the next election after losing from opposition.
The short version of this, and it's a bit tragic, or almost sort of literally in a kind of Greek sense, is hubris. Yeah. That it's just like there was a wide assumption that we did so well here, basically because we were great and we were right all along. And I remember a conference 2017 where Theresa May was doing a speech that she coughed through much of, that the sign fell off behind her, there was some heckler turned up with a notice for eviction or whatever. It was just like, this is a car crash. You watch this and you think, God, the Tories are basically finished. The next thought is, well, if the Tories are finished, we're going to win. And we just need a little bit more to get us over the line.
They basically believed that they could repeat what happened in 2017. They believed that they could move the debate away from Brexit, that they could essentially indefinitely ignore it or fudge it, and that when it came down to it, a campaign laser focused on public services could win the day.
My impression in the leader's office was that it held together actually pretty well up into 2017. That they were good at running campaigns and integrating what leader's office was doing with campaigning. That once they had more authority and more money and more resources, there was less clarity about how that should be applied. And that was probably not so much a Jeremy management issue as a broader political strategy issue.
At this point, let's look at the media. Has obviously long leaned towards the Conservatives, which means Labour has always had to fight harder to get a fair hearing. And for a left-wing Labour leader, that challenge is even tougher. Here's Max Guarini.
But we live in a time of information overload, right? Where we're constantly sort of bombarded with stuff via our phones, via our TVs, via, just walking down the street, there's advertisements everywhere. It's omnipresent. There's a need for news to compete with entertainment. And I think that's increased over the past 10 years. News has to be able to grab our attention. Right? If it doesn't, then it's not going to survive.
The press treated Corbyn really badly and constantly derided, and he was under an intense amount of scrutiny to the level that no Conservative leader would ever be under. Daily Mail headlines about him included apologist for terror, Marxist cult of Corbyn, and Corbyn's Britain would be a disaster. The Daily Telegraph said Jeremy Corbyn is a threat to national security and called him the Marxist who hates Britain. These are just examples, and it's obviously very hard to override this, but it is also questionable the extent to which Corbyn's team attempted to. Let's hear from James Meadway and James Schneider.
And you can't distinguish what happened with Jeremy Corbyn from what happened to the media treatment of Jeremy Corbyn. Like, first of all, the media was overwhelmingly hostile and overwhelmingly damaging and disruptive and a spoiler and unhelpful. And occasionally that would change, and there'll be ways to fight your way through this. But it was just relentless. My favourite one remains the Chairman Mao-style bicycle that the Telegraph highlighted at some point. Because Jeremy's on a bike, and who else had a bike? Boris Johnson has a bike. You call it Boris Johnson-style bicycle if you really wanted to, or just call it a bicycle, which is what it is.
Of course, he received lots of death threats and so on. He was harassed every day in a way that was completely disproportionate to any news-gathering value whatsoever outside his house by the media. It's because he challenged the interests of the rich and powerful. And most of the media is either a force for the status quo, and therefore indirectly a force for the rich and powerful, or directly a force for the rich and powerful.
Max did a lot of research into the media's portrayal of Corbyn as a danger. Corbyn's head of communications was Seamus Milne, a Guardian journalist who had also spent much of his time on the fringes of the mainstream left. Labour supporters who felt frustrated at Corbyn's media image often argued that Milne wasn't experienced enough to do this crucial role, and that though the media were harsh on Corbyn, they could have done more to ameliorate it.
So Damien McBride's book, who was Gordon Brown's comms guy, which is, makes for interesting reading. They're obsessed with what the Mail and the Sun are saying, and we basically didn't give a shit, and had a different approach all round.
Let's hear from Andrew Grice, political columnist at The Independent.
I think that he did not really want to engage with the media in the way that Blair, Brown, Miliband did. He regarded the media as an enemy, and any leader has to pretend that the media can be an ally. To get your message over, you have to go through the media. There's no way around it. You cannot avoid media scrutiny. It's a game that any leader, however unpalatable it may feel to them, has to play.
How did all this scrutiny impact Corbyn himself?
Of course it has an impact. It does have an effect. But he was almost uniquely skilled at dealing with it. He's not a great consumer of the media. He's not up there. He wasn't waking up early in the morning and worrying what Jim Naughtie was saying on the Today programme. That was other people's jobs.
How did Corbyn's team view the media?
So we were very disciplined. I mean, we had one rule, which Seamus said the whole time: is no one can ever lie. No one can ever lie, because if we lie, we lose all our credibility, and we're running uphill. The government can lie and lie and lie and lie, and the government does lie and lie and lie. The media are essentially part of the same side as them, whereas we're not part of the same side as them, so we would be eviscerated.
James Meadway says that there was a brief period after 2017 when they did have an easier time with the media, but it didn't last long.
You had about 6, maybe 8 months of it being like very significantly better. Partly because the result caught everyone by surprise. No one knew what to do with it. It looked like we might plausibly form the next government, so everyone starts to readjust themselves around this thought.
Let's hear Gabriel Pogrund's view about the media's responsibility in all this.
I imagine most newspaper editors from around that time would sort of absolutely acknowledge that. They were opposed to the antisemitism issues and the factional politics, and yes, they were subjected Corbyn to a lot of scrutiny. There's no doubt about that. I always felt there was a defeatism within the left on that topic. The Labour Party itself was founded, in the teeth of great opposition and most working class people not even having the franchise, never mind women. Are we really saying that print media is like the most insurmountable obstacle? I might be being defensive, but I always just thought it was slightly weird because it didn't. The extent to which they defined the problem that faced them as being the hostile media was sort of out of step with the ambition and optimism of the project generally.
Soon after the 2017 election, Brexit negotiations became the most prominent issue on the national agenda. Richard Corbett attended shadow cabinet meetings on this subject as leader of Labour in the European Parliament. He felt that Corbyn never really committed to fully understanding the issues that surrounded it.
Well, on Europe, he was, should we say, rather unsure of himself. Some people say, he was a closet Eurosceptic and was quite happy that we left. I'm not sure. I mean, he did campaign to remain in the referendum. He just wasn't very good at it. Lord Adonis said, Jeremy's problem with the European Union is that the European Union is not a Latin American liberation movement. One line quip, but It has an element of truth in it. It had never been his thing. He never really understood it. He had to get to know a lot of things during all the negotiations and the issues that came up. What is a customs union? What does it mean if you're not in it? What is a single market? What does it mean if you're not in it? And so on and so forth.
Keir Starmer, an MP newly elected in 2015, was Corbyn's shadow Brexit secretary. Let's hear from Starmer's biographer, Tom Baldwin.
He was frustrated by Corbyn's lack of engagement with Brexit right from the get-go, during the initial referendum campaign in 2016 and afterwards. He tells a story about sitting on the front bench, listening to Theresa May make a statement on Brexit, and he sat next to Jeremy Corbyn, and Jeremy Corbyn was reading Hansard about some cycleway in Camden, and saying, this is very important, this cycleway in Camden. Starmer was saying, actually, I'm trying to listen to the Prime Minister. This is really, really important. But cycleways are important too, Kit. And he just felt that this guy wasn't actually engaging in a pretty fundamental issue. And that frustrated him a lot.
James Meadway explains that as time went on, Corbyn's lack of direction on the issue meant Labour's position became more and more confused.
We have, until now, basically parked, and no one really had to think about too much because you sort of hide behind Theresa May and say, we're not going to be as bad as that. Once a real Brexit deal was on the table in early 2018 or so, it was like, okay, this is actually a real event and you're going to have to deal with the process and the politics of it and everything. And it became incredibly tangled very, very rapidly in a way we weren't prepared for. Should have, this is the benefit of hindsight, although it was floated at the time, like a single market, remaining in the single market position would have been the sensible thing to do. We didn't get that. We got the 52-48. So here we go. This is what it looks like. That was not breached, I think, mostly because no one then wanted to do the second thing, which is, that means we're going to have a row about freedom of movement. And everybody at this point was a bit like, we do not want to have a row about freedom of movement with a whole bunch of our MPs who are sitting there with a load of their constituents saying, we don't like freedom of movement very much. Or at the very least, this is how they interpreted a Leave vote. Probably rightly for some people. How many Labour voters were really that committed to this is not so clear, but that was the politics inside Labour.
There were those who saw this as an issue, some of them maybe even primarily as an issue in which they could get at Jeremy to regain control of the party, or in the end with Chucker and so on to split and create another party, which I think was a huge tactical mistake.
In 2019, when Parliament was in deadlock over Brexit, Corbyn did meet May to try and discuss a way forward.
May and Corbyn really didn't cooperate over Brexit until it was far too late. She is very much a tribal conservative and therefore working across the aisle with Labour was anathema to her until it became obvious that that might be the only thing that could get her Brexit deal through. Corbyn was no keener on working with the Conservatives or in helping them out of the fix that they were in. So while talks did at the last minute take place, I don't think they ever really stood a chance of producing anything. I think really those talks were more a sort of sign of desperation, really, rather than a potential solution.
Richard Corbett clearly found working with Corbyn on Brexit very frustrating.
And very courteous, and some of the things that he was accused of from time to time, I think, were clearly exaggerated. But yeah, he was just the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time.
In April 2018, a coalition of pro-EU groups and MPs launched the People's Vote campaign, calling for a second referendum on the final Brexit deal, which would include the option to remain in the EU. The first major People's Vote march in London drew around 100,000 people. The protests saw between 700,000 and 1 million, making them among the largest protests in modern British history.
Won't convince everybody, I'm not saying that, but enough to tip the balance in close situations. And let's not forget, this was a very close situation. 51.8% had voted leave. And opinion polls within a few months were showing that a majority would have voted to remain if there'd been a second referendum. The exact opposite of what most politicians expected, and indeed what most politicians did. Most politicians thought, we've had our debate, we've had the vote, it's settled, the country will rally behind the result. It didn't.
As the People's Vote campaign gained momentum, many Labour MPs and members demanded that the party back a second referendum. Corbyn stayed cautious, saying that Labour would keep all options on the table, but his focus remained on calling for a general election rather than another vote.
Often he'd agree in a meeting, quite early on even, yes, we must back a second referendum. And then after the meeting, he'd get collared by people, and then he'd say after, perhaps we need to think about this a bit more. And it was a bit like that.
I mean, people forget the People's Vote movement was very, very significant. Some of the biggest demonstrations in British history were around this issue. This has an impact, and it did have an impact.
Jeremy being pulled in different directions, also from his own entourage in his own office.
By mid-2019, Labour officially supported a confirmatory referendum on any Brexit deal, though Corbyn framed this as giving people the final say, not necessarily campaigning to remain.
We got there in the end, but too late. Back in 2019, never forget, because people do forget, how close we came to having another referendum. Because the autumn of that year, remember, Johnson couldn't get his deal through the House of Commons. And he couldn't call an early election. He tried, but at that time there was the Fixed Parliament Act and you needed a majority to vote for an early election. Our chief whip at the time, Nick Brown, said to me, at the moment, my tally is that we're 3 votes short of a majority for an amendment to tag onto the bill that this only comes into force if it's approved in a referendum. And he said, as chief whip, 3 votes, I can easily squeeze 3 extra votes for something if needed. So that's how close it was. When at that point, the Lib Dems went and said to Johnson, we're happy to vote for an early election because they thought they'd do well in it, which they didn't, and totally miscalculated. And that's how close it came to stopping Brexit.
Another key issue of Corbyn's leadership were claims of anti-Semitism within the party, and claims that he was anti-Semitic himself, having spent decades campaigning for Palestinian statehood. He had also spent decades campaigning against any kind of racism within society. As I mentioned earlier, under his leadership, the numbers of Labour members had grown hugely, and many new members were vocal critics of Israel and believed that the UK should be tougher on Israel. Complaints began to emerge of incidents of anti-Semitism within the party, and Corbyn faced criticism for giving a slow response to these complaints. Had Corbyn demonstrated more decisiveness and deftness in his leadership, it might not have become such a huge issue. In 2016, he had commissioned a report which found that the party was not overrun by anti-Semitism, but that incidents came from a small minority of members, often amplified by social media. It recommended changes to Labour's disciplinary procedures and to the education that was given to MPs, staff and members. Corbyn pledged to implement the reforms, but he had an avoidant approach to dealing with the claims overall. Here's Andy McSmith and James Schneider.
When you're in that sort of position, problems you never anticipated suddenly come over the hill and they're in front of you and you've got to deal with them. And Corbyn just thought it was so outrageous that anyone should even suggest he was anti-Semitic. He just sort of didn't do anything much to try and counter it.
They were very difficult to deal with for the team and for Jeremy personally. I mean, I think Jeremy found it both wounding and incomprehensible.
John McDonnell responded really quickly.
And John, and it is to his credit, I think was really sharp on this from the off. Very early on, it was just like we should have it. He said this in interviews: zero tolerance, get people out if they're anti-Semites, get them out of the party. We don't want them in, and that is absolutely the right position to take. And there shouldn't really be any mucking around in this.
While Corbyn always insisted that there was no place for anti-Semitism in the party, his slow leadership contributed to the issue getting out of control.
And it caused me just frequent bouts of despair to see more after 2018 or so. It was by the end of 2018 into 2019 is when I thought it was really like, what the hell is going on? Just these sort of bouts of despair, like how this was allowed to fester when various people should have just been summarily expelled.
James Schneider is Jewish. Let's hear his view.
There is actually existing anti-Semitism on the left, including in the Labour Party membership. It is small, but it is real, and it needs dealing with. And if you don't deal with it, because you've got crap processes, which, without going into the whole detail of it, for example, I personally pointed out a Holocaust denier, and that person had no action taken against them by the supposedly professional regime that existed under McNichol, etc. But insufficiently good at getting the process and insufficiently good at education, being very firm on that.
While all this was going on, the media, who, as we've just looked at, were extremely critical of Corbyn, obviously wrote a lot of stories about these issues going on within the Labour Party. Then, in March 2018, it emerged that in 2012, Corbyn had commented on a Facebook post about a mural being taken down, which contained anti-Semitic tropes, saying to the artist, "You are in good company. Rockefeller destroyed Diego Vieira's mural because it includes a picture of Lenin." This was an incredibly damaging moment, as it was seen as concrete evidence that Corbyn himself was anti-Semitic, something that people had been looking for a long time. He apologised, stating, "I sincerely regret that I did not look more closely at the image I was commenting on, the contents of which are deeply disturbing and anti-Semitic." As a consequence of this coming out, around 600 people campaigned outside Parliament, including 15 Labour MPs. The crowd chanted, "Enough is enough."
Is the Labour Party itself more anti-Semitic than wider British society? The evidence actually tends to suggest not, if you look for where anti-Semitism lies and where it comes from and who's coming out with this stuff, but that doesn't give you any excuses in terms of dealing with it. And there was a particular story about the mural that Jeremy Corbyn in some past moment had said what a shame it was that this basically anti-Semitic mural had been painted out by Tower Hamlets Council. And that's a passing comment on Facebook. It doesn't amount to very much. It wasn't a wise thing to say, and it wasn't smart, and people should pay more attention to what they're commenting on. But hey, and that once that was there, I think this is where things started to spiral in terms of the discussion about Jeremy's own personal role in this. Because otherwise, genuinely, I don't think he's an anti-Semite, and I don't think it was possible to make this story stick to him personally. But there was a problem with Labour, and it's brought a dysfunction, and that's well noted by this book.
In April 2018, Jenny Formby, an ally of Corbyn, took over as Labour's General Secretary and began tightening disciplinary procedures and recruiting more staff to deal with anti-Semitism cases. But it was too little, too late. In February 2019, 7 MPs left the Labour Party in protest at Corbyn's approach to Brexit and anti-Semitism. The Conservatives, in a sense, cashed in on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, the Conservative Party has its own problems with racism and in particular with Islamophobia, but clearly they were able to paint Jeremy Corbyn and his allies as anti-Semites. that, I think, had an effect on the way that the electorate perceived Labour as, dangerous, radical, and in some ways quite unpleasant. And I think, the Conservatives did their absolute best to punch that bruise.
There were constant stories about Corbyn and Labour's anti-Semitism in the media throughout these years, giving the public the impression that it was an enormous issue.
There are studies out there, that look at this, right? There's a great book, I think, called Bad News for Labour, which looks at, they do sort of interviews, focus groups, and they ask people, what kind of impression they had. And I think there was one which stands out to me, which is a focus group in maybe Cardiff or Newport, in which they asked people about the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And there was kind of, I think, a consensus amongst this one group, which kind of believed that the number of Labour Party members being investigated for anti-Semitism was around the 40% mark, which, of course, it was nowhere near that.
The real figure was 0.06%. Ultimately, Corbyn's failure to act more quickly and decisively, along with poor media management, allowed the story to grow out of control to a really, really damaging level.
But all they see is Labour problem not fixed, Labour problem not fixed, Labour problem not fixed. And I think that, that's of course a net negative. I think, again, as I was saying before, Jeremy's the main message carrier. And if most interviews have mainline on Brexit, and that, that's a net negative for us, and then have some anti-Semitism where that's a net negative for us, then it dilutes his power as a communicator, and that can be seen objectively, I think, in his media interviews.
As the prolonged problem of anti-Semitism shows, Corbyn struggled with aspects of leadership.
There are some points where you, as party leader, potentially about to be prime minister, definitely have to look more like a normal politician. Normal is a slightly pejorative word, but a conventional politician. And that wasn't always what he did or how he acted, how he behaved. I mean,
we had some duds in the shadow cabinet, both politically and in sort of skill level, who a lot of us in the team wanted to move on and bring in some other people. But Jeremy was always loyal to them because, these people, they'd stepped up when the time, they've been doing the job, they're working hard, etc. I think with hindsight, when he got more power within the party, he should have been firmer against the division. He can't really prioritize between people. He can't, which if you're working for him, it can be very annoying. He can't see that you need to go and do this interview because it's live at this time, because he's talking to somebody he's met in the street who wants to talk to him about something to do with mental health or something, something like that. But that is what he is like.
Looking back onto our side was a sort of a collective failure to kind of appreciate that the Labour Party is like this. The battle in the Labour Party is a battle for that sort of middle ground of it, of people who sort of want a Labour government that will do nice things. And I'm being a bit sort of sweeping, but that's kind of where a lot of even Labour MPs end up. They're not particularly ideological in that kind of old-fashioned sense of it, right? They just want a Labour government that will do the right thing. And if you have a convincing vision of what that might look like, these people are winnable. I don't think that was ever pushed hard enough when Jeremy was running the Labour Party leadership, or at least it wasn't pushed in the right way. I think after 2017, he had a version of it which was, we were right all along, so you just have to agree with us, which is not quite... I'm condensing it a bit, but there was that sort of attitude that started to come through a little bit too much if you take what was a failing on our side.
Eventually, relations with John McDonnell deteriorated.
Relations between the Shadow Treasury and the Leader's Office started to appear, for instance, and that's where you could see this sort of decay from relatively early 2018, probably summer 2018, down to the election in 2019.
And Corbyn became somewhat removed from many key conversations.
He became also, it has to be said, quite inscrutable and quite difficult to read to a lot of people by the end as well. It was sort of clear, he was getting advice from plenty of people, but it wasn't actually that clear whose advice he any longer really trusted or agreed with. I mean, he did his absolute best to not reveal his hand on Brexit until the 11th hour, and even then it wasn't that clear what his position was. So in the end, people sort of made decisions around him rather than through him.
Obviously, one of the main accusations against Corbyn was the constant accusation of him being too left-wing.
I mean, if you go and dig out what Jeremy was arguing for in 2015 or 2017 or even 2019 and compare those manifestos to, what Labour would be standing on, or never mind Labour, what the SDP would be standing on in 1983. I mean, it's a long way to the right in practice. Like, things have shifted a long way over that period of time. This was not a particularly radical set of proposals, either in terms of Labour's history or in terms of wider European social democracy.
In June 2019, Theresa May resigned, and leading Brexiteer Boris Johnson was elected Conservative leader and Prime Minister. He called an election for the 12th of December 2019. By this point, James Meadway says even the ideas within the party had just somewhat run out of steam, and the 2019 manifesto was overfilled with policies.
Probably post-2017, where it became more apparent, was that... How to describe this? There were sort of limitations in what the left had to say about the world. That we got some distance in 2017 with a set of inherited policy positions, often from the 1980s, which would be things like obvious ones: don't do austerity, spend more money on a bunch of things people like, tax the rich to go and do that. A bit more investment spending would be a good idea, and wouldn't be nice if some things were publicly owned. And then beyond that, it wasn't very clear like what you would say next. Brexit being the most obvious example, it was just sort of parked as an issue. Europe was parked as an issue, and then it was not really clear what you would actually do if you had to not be in the European Union. Now, John, to his credit, was someone who always wanted to encourage a big policy discussion and loads of different ideas and pick from this. I think by 2019, that had kind of become, we'll have loads of ideas and they will all literally go in the manifesto, which is not what you want. So there's that other bit of what is the actual strategy and what does a strategy for a left look like? Because it was sort of, after 2017, it turned into one more heave. It's like, we're going to kind of win the next election, so we just have to sit here and wait for the Tories to fall apart. And it was quite clear to me that, like, because the left had been so far removed from power for so long, it had not had the need to update what it said about what it would do. Like, so everything was just sort of off the shelf, dust it off, and like, this is what you're going to do. And it didn't really gel.
The Conservatives had learnt from their terrible election campaign in 2017. While years of Labour seeming divided and indecisive had damaged Corbyn a lot.
Labour were probably over-promising in their manifesto, so much so that actually a lot of the promises that they made while they were individually quite popular, came over as a package, quite irresponsible. The main lesson, which you can see very clearly in 2019, is to not fight a campaign like that ever again. They were very careful to build the campaign around the leader that they had by that time, Boris Johnson, who was of course capable of carrying a much more kind of presidential campaign. They got their digital content and buying right.
They hired this firm called Guarini, and one of the sort of founding members of this agency was quoted as saying that your messaging needs to be like water dripping on a stone. Like, day in, day out, you need to sort of send the same message. So this team was hired by the Conservative Party, and they basically engaged in the process in which basically you pump out sort of stuff that looks like it's been organically citizen-made, content. So it looks a little bit doesn't look very polished. It looks a little bit rough around the edges. It's made to look like it's been made by someone in their, in their little in their front room, but in fact it's made by a professional agency.
Much better prepared in terms of voter identification and their IT systems, and they had also more time to train local organisers than had been the case in 2017. And I think in some ways, most important of all, unlike in 2017, I think the Conservatives were very, very aware that they had to have a good justification or a rationale for calling an election when one wasn't necessarily due. And in 2017, they didn't really have that. In 2019, they had a much more convincing explanation, which was we need to get Brexit done in order to get on with the priorities of the British people. And a lot of people, even some of those who didn't support Brexit, just wanted it over with and saw that as a good reason for calling an election, particularly when the Conservatives could say that the existing Parliament was blocking Brexit.
2019, it actually was a Brexit election. Like, the country was in a state of gridlock because of the gridlock that existed in Parliament.
I think if you put the two leaders together, Johnson was always going to come off better. I think if you looked at the Brexit positions of the two main parties, I think it was more likely that the Conservatives would get a benefit from theirs than Labour would from their rather complicated position. And I think also the Conservatives were prepared to make promises on health, on education, and on policing that they probably couldn't deliver, but were prepared to say whatever it took to get them into power. I think Corbyn's twisting and turning on Brexit didn't help. He was already distrusted by Brexiteers, obviously, but he was also deserted by some Remainers as a result.
Johnson won a landslide majority of 80 seats, gaining 66. Labour suffered their worst results since 1935, losing 55 seats, many in the so-called Red Wall, the Leave-voting but traditionally Labour constituencies. Labour's share of the vote fell by 8 points.
We didn't lose because people weren't agreeing with the things that Jeremy wanted to speak about. We lost because non-traditional Tory voting Leave voters turned out en masse to secure Brexit because we had a bad Brexit policy. And then the second is when your main message carrier is your leader, which is the case, they need to be able to speak and be heard in their own voice about their own things. Now, in 2017, Jeremy could speak and be heard in his own voice in a way like never before. In 2019, because it was a Brexit election, that means at the beginning of every interview, he's asked about Brexit, where he looks more like the traditional politician than Boris Johnson, because he is trying to dance around an issue because we didn't have a clear and communicable position, versus Boris Johnson saying, yeah, get Brexit done, yeah, other ruddy deal, yeah, great. And that was the issue, not that he was too comfortable speaking to left-wing people or preaching to the choir or any of that stuff. That's garbage.
I think there was a YouGov poll, right, in December 2019, and they asked people on the reasons for not voting Labour amongst people who had previously voted Labour in 2017. And 35% of respondents cited Corbyn's leadership as their main reason.
I certainly think if Brexit hadn't been the issue that killed us, then things would have been rather different. And so you've got to point that out as our key strategic failure.
It just was never going to be enough to ignore the Brexit question when it had, in actual fact, become the central question, even though Corbyn would have said, whether we're in or out, it's all about, the industrial strategy and how we treat the poor. I mean, it had become the issue, but also Boris Johnson had effectively defined it as the issue too.
Corbyn resigned as leader, apologising for what he termed the catastrophic defeat. 1 year later, Corbyn would have the whip withdrawn by new leader Keir Starmer for his response to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission's report into Labour's handling of antisemitism, which he still said had been dramatically overstated. He's currently leading a new party, currently called Your Party, with fellow left-wing MP Zara Sultana. Let's look at his legacy as Labour leader.
Somebody can be a good person and a bad leader, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I would say that, looking back now, there has been a quite dramatic change in the tone and tenor of the debate within British politics about the role that the state can and should play. He has played, there's no doubt he played a role in that, especially during the election in 2017.
We very dramatically shifted the dial on what was politically possible around what you say in the economy. Like, this opened up a whole discussion, and it's kind of it's an argument that's taking place across the developed world about, you know, neoliberalism not really working anymore. So what do you do instead? But in Britain, it's landed in a particular way, and that's because Jeremy's leadership was there to force it open. I think the big one is that we've created a much more robust left than has existed in Britain in any period in my life. The fact you have a sort of left media ecosystem, organisations like Novara that exist now, the fact you have like the younger people in Britain are overwhelmingly of the left is in part because of what Jeremy Corbyn has done.
Yeah, I think the way Corbyn handled it has, and the way that the left since his defeat has responded, has 100% made the possibility of a left leader more remote. You know, the left's sort of always there, but you know, the way that they have responded to Corbyn's defeat and the way that Corbyn conducted himself in office have probably made it more inconceivable than ever before that the left will take the reins of the party. Starmer, in the 2021 conference, passed reforms that technically make it far more difficult for a left-wing candidate to stand, because they've raised the threshold of MP signatures required to get a left-wing MP or any MP on the ballot.
We didn't transform the culture and practices of the party, and we should be ruining it now. Those are the two biggest strategic mistakes. Brexit, because that was our electoral failure, and democratising the party, because that means that the party's been taken back over as a vehicle for corporate interests to channel their private interests into public policy, which is now the effective role of the Labour Party.
You can say it, but it's almost obsolete or redundant to say, you know, it's a great tragedy for the left that their leader happened to be somebody as uniquely ill-suited to conventional political leadership as Corbyn, because the whole point is he only got elected because he was deemed by people like David Lammy and Margaret Beckett, who voted for him to get on the ballot, as being inoffensive and non-threatening.
The Labour Party, throughout its history, has had a split nature. It's had one foot in the forces and people that wish to transform the order of society, and it's had one foot in the existing order of society. And generally speaking, it's been the latter group that's been in charge, but it's always given some reforms or some effort to engage with the other side. And we had the biggest win for the forces that wish to change society to make the Labour Party its vehicle. And if you look at the pace of change in running in the other direction, we didn't institutionalise that.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on Jeremy Corbyn, the final in our series on the former Labour Party leaders. And thank you so much for listening to the whole series. It's been such a pleasure to make, and I'm so glad that people have been able to enjoy and learn from it. Today, we heard from Gabriel Pogrund, Andy McSmith, James Schneider, James Meadway, Max Guarini, Tim Bale, Richard Corbett, Tom Baldwin, and Neil Kinnock. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy their brilliant books, are in the description of this episode. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. The artwork for this episode is by Francesca Lordan. Music is by Rickard From.